And I mean, it's like a Stephen King horror novel, the pain that we have among us. I mean, we are talking here about, I'm not cutting my words tonight, everybody that has caused the pain in our lives for legacy of generations, they are evil, sociopathic bastards. And I don't use bad language very often. You have to be real here. What they have done, that you saw the photographs on the screen, children, strangulation, horrendous violence acts, and these people are not being held responsible. I mean, we will never know when Brian Kearney is released. The only reason I came on tonight was to make sure that he sees me here tonight with my sister, and I'm sure everybody else feels the same. We're hoping that in the prison tonight they are watching our pain, because we will not let them out of our minds, and we will fight to a proper judicial review is done of the mandatory life sentence.
Angela.
On the 28th of February 2006, Siobhan McLoughlin was found dead in a locked bedroom at her home in Knocknashee, Goatstown, Dublin 14. At first glance, it looked as if she had tragically taken her own life. But within hours after her death, Gardaí and the McLoughlin family felt sure that she had been brutally murdered. But would the state be able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? Goatstown is a small south side suburb of Dublin, in a pretty well-to-do area. Goatstown is mainly a residential area with extensive housing developments from the middle decades of the 20th century onwards. A number of roads run through it, and the Lewis Green Line runs through the southwest corner of Goatstown, and the Dundrum Lewis stop is nearby. For those of you not in the know, the Lewis is a tram light rail system in Dublin. There are two main lines, the Green and the Red Line, and it came into use in 2004. The word Lewis, translated from Irish into English, is speed. Siobhan was one of 8 children, 7 girls and 1 boy, to the parents of Owen and Deirdre McLoughlin. Siobhan worked as a chef in the canteen of an electrical firm, and in 1989, at the age of 21, she would meet a man, Brian Kearney, 31. Brian worked as an electrical engineer for this firm, a very good job. Siobhan lived in an apartment while Brian lived with his toddler daughter Aisling from a previous relationship. Brian's wife and mother of his child had died from natural causes a few years prior to Siobhan and him meeting, leaving Brian to raise his daughter alone. Eventually Siobhan would move in with Brian and his daughter. They renovated this house and then decided to sell it. Siobhan decided to set up her own catering business, as she had trained in the Shelbourne Hotel, and she was way ahead of her time when it came to food. She used ingredients that were alien to Ireland in the 90s, but would be considered the norm now. Gone were the meat and potatoes era. I remember if you had more than 2 things on the plate back then to eat, you were eating out. Brian was not only an electrical engineer, he also owned a music shop called Music City, which he sold in 2005. In 1995, the pair got engaged, but then split up. They did keep in some contact with each other over the years, meeting for dinner every few months. While they were separated, Brian never moved on to any other relationship, and eventually they got back together. In January 2002, they got married and Siobhan was expecting a baby. Their son Daniel was born 6 months later. That same year, Brian and Siobhan travelled to Spain on holidays, at the prospect of buying a boat. But while there, they came across a building, a 200-year-old merchant's mansion on the island of Mallorca in Spain. They bought it and converted it into a boutique hotel. It had 6 luxury bedrooms and a heated outdoor pool. The couple bought the property for €2.5 million, and Brian did most of the renovations himself. Siobhan was a visionary, travelling from place to place, picking up pieces for the hotel, along with her impeccable taste in furnishings. Siobhan's culinary skills is what would make the hotel a success. The hotel opened in January 2003, and Siobhan's barbecues quickly became a highlight of guest stay and among the locals. Siobhan and Brian would travel back and forth between Mallorca and Ireland, although Brian would travel back more frequently during the holiday season, which was between March and December. This left Siobhan running the show in Mallorca, while also trying to raise their son Daniel. Later, people that knew Siobhan there would say that towards the end they could see Siobhan was not happy, and she was exhausted from doing everything, and they felt there was an atmosphere when Brian was around. But because Siobhan's family was so big, she would get frequent visits from one or a few of them, and she was very glad to see them, and it seemed to put a pep in her step when she had them all around her. I think Siobhan was very independent, but also valued the closeness of her family. A few years into owning the property in Spain, Brian and Siobhan decided to build a new house beside their property in Dublin, hoping to sell the original house and move into the new house or rent out either of the properties. In December 2005, Siobhan returned home to Dublin for the off-season. In January 2006, she sought advice from a solicitor on the best way to go about getting a legal separation and what she needed to do. The solicitor advised her to keep a diary of the goings-on between herself and Brian. She enrolled their son Daniel in a local school and was going to approach Brian about her and their son moving into the new house that was being built next door. While a podcast I listened to stated that Siobhan was going back to Spain and continuing her life over there, I don't think this is true. While Siobhan loved what she had built out there, she was very much on her own, overworked and trying to raise their son, with no family around her for support. I think she came home for good, so she would be near her family and friends. On the morning of Tuesday, the 28th of February 2006, it was Brian's birthday. Siobhan's sister Niamh arrived as usual at Siobhan's house. While she normally arrived at 9 a.m. to leave her car in the driveway and get the Lewis into the city, this morning she did not arrive until 9:30 a.m. As she had her own key, she let herself into the house and found 3-year-old Daniel wandering around on his own downstairs. Niamh then went upstairs to Siobhan's bedroom door and found it was locked, and there was no reply when she called her name. Niamh then rang her father and mother and informed them of the situation. When Owen, the father, arrived, he broke down the door and found Siobhan lying in the bedroom near the ensuite door. Owen reached down and touched Siobhan on the head and then the leg and found she was cold. He knew there and then his beloved daughter was dead. She was only 38 years old. The key to the bedroom was found on the floor, only inches away from the main bedroom door, and it looked like it had been pushed under. Owen then rang for the Gardaí straight away. When they arrived and examined the scene, they felt it was staged. Photos had been placed around Siobhan, nearly like a shrine. A vacuum cord was somewhat wrapped around Siobhan, and the cord had been broken. When the forensic team arrived and examined the scene, they found indentations at the top of the ensuite door, and the other part of the vacuum cord was wrapped around the door handle on the inside of the door, to make it look like she had tried to hang herself. It would come out later in court that the cord would have snapped within 5 seconds from the weight of Siobhan, and she would have had to have been at least 6 inches off the ground. These two things, combined with other factors, told them it was impossible for Siobhan to have taken her own life. It was also determined that Siobhan had been dead a few hours, as rigor mortis had already begun to set in. The Gardaí imposed a 2-day media blackout of the case and advised the family not to speak to the press following Siobhan's killing. It was said that the Gardaí took this step to try and avoid publicity of the case and repeating what had happened in the Rachel O'Reilly case 18 months before. No charges had yet been brought in that case. The blackout was lifted on the Thursday, 2 days later. When Brian arrived home after his mother-in-law rang him, she told him that Siobhan was dead. He was not greeted by much sympathy from the family. The McLoughlin family all gathered in the kitchen, united by grief, while Brian sat in the living room with his sister consoling him. Straight away the family referred to Siobhan by her maiden name and would continue to do so into the future. Obviously they knew something that the rest of us didn't. Brian was quiet but questioned could he leave, only to be told he had to speak to the detectives first. He also questioned would they want the clothes he was wearing, which was weird. Carney was eventually allowed to leave after speaking with the detectives, and he did not hand over the clothes for testing, as he had asked for specific clothes from the back bedroom to change into. The Gardaí did not want to give him these clothes, so they let him leave with the clothes he was wearing. He went to stay with his parents along with Daniel. Later that evening, Gardaí went to the house to retrieve the clothes he was wearing, and it was discovered that his mother had washed the clothes. Very convenient. On Thursday, the 2nd of March, 49-year-old Brian was brought in for questioning and was held for 12 hours. Reports stated that he was picked up from his parents' home. He would not answer any of the questions put to him, after saying he would be readily available to help with the investigation. He was released that evening. Gardaí told the press that they were carrying out further inquiries and a file would be prepared for the DPP. The Gardaí interviewed friends and family, and they discovered that Siobhan was unhappy in her marriage and had visited a solicitor weeks before she died, and she had contacted the Citizen Advice Bureau for advice on separation and dividing assets. Family also revealed that they were suspicious of Brian and that he was a controlling individual, giving them an example of Siobhan being made to take out the dishes from the dishwasher and being made to wash them by hand, as it was too expensive to run the dishwasher. He controlled the money and she would have to run everything by him. She sold her apartment and Brian moved them to Spain. One of the sisters would say it was his dream to move to Spain and not Siobhan's. Siobhan's life was in Ireland and she had no one in Spain, that it was his way of isolating her from her friends and family. Meanwhile, as the investigation continued, the Gardaí, through interviews and statements from the family, friends and neighbours, Brian's alibi was being undermined and circumstantial evidence was building. There was also a growing rift between the Kearneys and the McLoughlin family. Brian delayed the funeral by 10 days after asking for a second autopsy. When a death notice was published in the newspaper, the McLoughlin family referred to Siobhan as McLoughlin and not Kearney, and never mentioned Brian. Brian, in the meantime, published a separate notice in a different newspaper. At the funeral on the 11th of March, a picture was placed beside the coffin of Siobhan and her son, and again Brian was left out. Also at the funeral, the Kearney and McLoughlin sat separately in the church. They didn't look at each other or interact on the day. That's us Irish, we pull no punches. When it comes to our gut feeling, everyone will know our true feelings about someone. The week after the funeral, the Gardaí travelled to Spain and conducted a search of the hotel Siobhan and Brian owned. Also, Brian's mobile data was recovered, and it put him at the scene of the crime at the time they thought Siobhan died. Witnesses said they saw Brian in the driveway at the time he said he was at his brother's on the morning of the murder, and his DNA was found on part of the vacuum cord. On the 22nd of June 2006, Brian was arrested again and questioned at Dundrum Garda Station. He was questioned for 8 hours before being released again without charge. Gardaí felt they had enough evidence at this stage and sent a complete file to the DPP of all the new evidence gathered over the months. Now it was just a waiting game. Meanwhile, Brian went to Spain to overlook all the preparations in lieu of the hotel opening for the new season. But what was to be a fully booked season, cancellations started to come in once word got out about the murder, and staff also walked out, deeming it was too difficult to work now that Siobhan would be no longer there. She was the backbone to the success of the business, and the staff's loyalty was to Siobhan and not Brian, which says a lot to the type of person Siobhan was. The Gardaí again returned to the hotel in Spain, and under oath in front of a Spanish judge, the staff gave evidence about Siobhan's demeanour in the weeks before her death. On December 10, 2006, Siobhan's family held a vigil outside her house where she was killed. Her sister Niamh would say, "We are utterly distraught without Siobhan, but we are equally determined and will not rest until her killer is brought to justice." Siobhan was the embodiment of fun, life, joy, a terrific mother and an adorable and hilarious sister and daughter, a true friend, and she will never be forgotten. 200 people turned up at the vigil. They held hands, sang hymns and held up pictures of Siobhan. In January 2007, the newspapers once again spoke to Gardaí sources, and they said they are confident that an arrest will be made soon, but the amount of evidence was substantial and it would take time to get through it. On Tuesday, the 17th of January 2007, the inquest into Siobhan's death was postponed. The McLoughlin family appealed to the public for fresh information to convict the main suspect, Brian, as the DPP announced they needed even more evidence to go for a conviction of murder against Brian. Brian did not attend the short hearing. Friday, the 28th of February 2007, a year to the day Siobhan was killed, the McLoughlin family arranged another vigil and a mass in the Church of the Assumption in Dalkey. They again pleaded for information to get justice for Siobhan. Brian, Daniel and the Carney family did not attend this gathering. They decided to spend that time away from Ireland in Spain. Newspaper journalists decided to seek them out and try and get a statement. Brian's mother spoke to them and said her son was innocent and asked them to stop harassing them. They also said they held their own anniversary mass in Spain. How true this is, I don't know, as they couldn't even name the church in Spain that this mass was held in. On the 30th of May 2007 at 6:50 a.m, Carney was arrested at his home he had built next door to the original house. He was living there with his daughter and son Daniel. He was brought to Dundrum Garda Station and charged with Siobhan's murder. After this, he was brought to Dunleary District Court, where he was officially charged and remanded to Cloverhill Prison until the following week. His only response to the charges were not guilty. No application for bail was made at that time. The McLoughlin family were there for the hearing, and Carney did not make eye contact with them and chewed gum through the whole process. So disrespectful. After 6 days in prison, Carney was released on bail on Wednesday the 6th of June 2007, after bringing an appeal to the High Court sitting at Cloverhill Prison the day before. His conditions were to surrender his passport, pay €100 and produce an independent juror to provide €55,000 bond, which was provided by his brother Patrick. He also had to sign on every week at Dundrum Garda Station. In July, a date was set for the trial to begin 6 months later, and a timestamp of 4 weeks set aside to hear all evidence and a verdict. So the trial was to begin in early 2008. On Monday, the 11th of February, Carney appeared for trial in front of Justice Barry White and a jury of 12 people. He entered a plea of not guilty. Soon a problem would arise with the jury. It was discovered that one of the jury members worked for a home security company that had installed a system into the Carney residence 10 years before and had continued servicing this system over the years. While the juror had only worked in the company for 18 months, it was considered a conflict of interest. While the defence were happy to continue with only 11 jurors, the prosecution were not, and the judge agreed with the prosecution. The jury were dismissed and a new one had to be sworn in. A week later, with the new jury, the proceedings began again. It was the prosecution's case that Carney had strangled Siobhan with a vacuum cord, tried to hoist her body over the door of the ensuite to make it look like suicide, left the room, locked the door from the outside, and pushed the key under the door to make it seem it was locked from the inside. He then gave his 3-year-old son breakfast, left him wandering around downstairs and went to work. How you could do this boggles my mind. He also said there was no evidence to suggest Siobhan was planning to take her own life. She had visited a solicitor and contacted the Citizen Advice Bureau about a separation. She had enrolled Daniel in school and even made a hair appointment for that week. The McLoughlin family also gave evidence about what had happened that morning, from Niamh arriving and finding Daniel alone, to going upstairs and finding the bedroom door locked. Owen, Siobhan's father, also gave evidence of breaking the door down and finding Siobhan dead on the floor. Deirdre, Siobhan's mother, also gave evidence of what happened that morning, that she arrived at the house with her husband and how she looked after Daniel while Owen had gone upstairs to find Siobhan dead, and when he broke the news to Niamh, Niamh had rung the Gardaí and she had rung Carney to come home. She said when Carney arrived home, she broke the news to him that Siobhan was dead upstairs. When she had been on the phone to him, she had not told him what was wrong, and Carney never asked. Deirdre also confirmed that in 1999, Siobhan had signed herself into St. John of God's psychiatric unit after suffering from stress at work and what was described as a little breakdown. But after 5 days, she returned to work. Bridget, Siobhan's sister, stated that in 2005, Carney phoned her to say that Siobhan was suffering from her nerves again. But when Bridget phoned, Siobhan was perfectly fine and was amazed that Carney had said such a thing. Colin Ward was next to give evidence. He worked for Keller's Electrical with Carney. He said Carney was in the habit of arriving to work between 8:30 a.m. and 9 a.m. But on the morning of Siobhan's murder, he arrived extra early, between 7:50 a.m. and 8 a.m. Siobhan's solicitor was next to take the stand, and he stated that a number of letters had been sent to Carney about the separation and that he never replied to any of the correspondence. Carney's statement to Gardaí was then read out. Carney told the Gardaí that on the morning of Siobhan's death, that he had noticed her door was locked. The night before, Siobhan and Daniel had come home from a visit to her friend's house at around 8:30 p.m. and Carney had put Daniel to bed and slept in the same room as him, while Siobhan slept in the master bedroom. Carney had said they woke at 7 a.m. the next morning, had breakfast, and Carney put on a DVD for Daniel, went upstairs to brush his teeth and went to go into Siobhan's room, but it was locked. He called out he was leaving, went downstairs, kissed Daniel goodbye and left for work. I know any of you that are parents or not parents, you don't leave a child downstairs on their own, with no response from the other person that is responsible for the child, and just walk out the door to work. One of the days court was adjourned when one of the jurors, who was pregnant, became ill and was unable to attend. It was discussed that the trial might continue with a reduced jury, but the next day she was well enough to continue her jury duty. Demonstrations were also done in court using the original door from the ensuite, and it was deemed impossible that Siobhan could have hung herself from the door, giving her height, her weight and strength of the cord. State pathologist Mary Cassidy then took to the stand. She arrived at the house at 4 p.m. that day and observed marks around Siobhan's neck and chin. There were 3 fractures to her larynx, blood in her mouth and abrasions on her chin. She said the marks on her neck did not come from being suspended. She said a significant amount of force had been applied to her neck for a significant amount of time, and her body had been disturbed after her death by a third person. She testified that Siobhan had been assaulted while she was in bed and gripped by the neck and rendered semi-unconscious, and then a ligature applied to accelerate her death. Dr. Cassidy also stated that if she had died from hanging, that the cord would still be around her neck, but instead it was found around her waist, and no one had disturbed the scene. The Gardaí testified that they had found no forced entry into the house. Windows and doors were in good working order. The alarm company stated that the alarm had been activated at 10:50 p.m. and immediately switched off the night before. A nighttime setting was immediately alarmed, and this was switched off at 7:37 a.m. the next morning. Gardaí also stated that a detailed search was done within the Carney home. In the hot press or airing cupboard to some, a diary was found. The writing inside was confirmed as Siobhan's by her sister. Siobhan was advised by her solicitor to keep a diary of events of her marriage to Carney. In addition, wrapped in sheets and clothing, her passport was found. In another area, a €500 note was found in a drawer among wrapping paper. A financial forensic agent was next to take the stand, and she said that Carney was €845,000 in debt against the family home. In 2004, his monthly income was €10,000 net. His repayments were close to €15,000. Carney did own properties in Ireland and had a stake in the electrical business plus the hotel, but while he was asset rich, he was cash poor. On Monday the 3rd of March, closing arguments began. The defence were first. They said the prospect of splitting with Siobhan did not suit Carney financially. He wanted to sell one of the houses at Knocknashee, but if Siobhan wanted to move into one of them, this would not be an option, and Carney would have to work out his debt in some other way. The fact that Siobhan had started to squirrel away money, hiding her passport, keeping a diary of her relationship with Carney, and sending solicitor letters, showed her seriousness of leaving him. Siobhan was looking forward to her future and making plans, showed that she was not suicidal. The evidence shown by forensics also showed that it was next to impossible that she had taken her own life. Carney even admitted that he, Siobhan and their son had been the only ones present that night. The defence recommended caution in the case. They said the prosecution had shown no hard evidence, that it was all circumstantial evidence, and they needed to pay attention to what was missing in the case. There was no history of violence, no custody dispute, no alcohol abuse or jealousy. The jury were asked to ignore the emotions of the McLoughlin family when they were giving evidence. We all know that there doesn't have to be outwardly signs of abuse. It's the rabbit hole of coercive control, which the family would say there was plenty of.
She was strangled. She met him at a very young age. There wasn't any violence, but there was extreme levels of control. Tell her to take the dirty dishes out of the dishwasher and hand wash them because it cost too much money. When she finally said, I'm going to solicitor, this is it, it's over, that's when he couldn't cope. He took Siobhan's life. Women were only deemed to be in danger if a man had struck them or if they had been attacked in some way. It took that. But now we know this is a separate entity. And sometimes it's in conjunction with violence. But in and of itself, coercive control is a brutality of its own. We're talking about the 2020s now, and we're only dealing with this now.
On the 4th of March, Justice Barry White charged the jury and referred to the victim as Rachel rather than Siobhan in his summing up. This was a terrible mistake. It so happened that at the same time he was overseeing the case of Rachel O'Reilly, and he apologised. It wasn't the first or the last time that both women would be mentioned in each other's trial, as they both had died within 18 months of each other under similar circumstances. The jury were discharged that evening, and the following evening they came back with a verdict of guilty of murder by a majority verdict of 11-1. The McLoughlins wept and hugged each other as the verdict sunk in. Carney made no reaction. His daughter, who sat next to him, wept, and Carney took his wedding ring off and took his wallet out and handed them to her. Carney was sentenced to life there and then, and the McLoughlins asked to give a victim impact statement, but this was denied, which I don't understand why. Carney was escorted to a van and brought to Whitfield Prison to start his sentence. Carney lodged an appeal straight away, and it was heard in 2009, and the 3-judge panel dismissed the appeal. In 2012, Carney was refused permission to bring his appeal to the Supreme Court. 7 years later, in 2019, Carney was refused applications for parole on 2 occasions, but Bridget, Siobhan's sister, told her local radio news network that Carney had been recommended for 2 outside prison visits with his family. It was an indication that the parole board were getting him ready for release, but the parole board will only recommend him for release if he admits his guilt, which he has never done, although the Minister for Justice has final say on any release. As of 2022, Carney is still behind bars. He is a trained counsellor to help other inmates with their mental health and works for the organisation The Samaritans. He is also trained in first aid. While in prison, he decided to sell the hotel in Spain, but then took it off the market in 2010, and it was then run by his brother Patrick and his wife. It is still open, but maybe under new ownership since then. I can't tell from the booking website. He said he wanted to keep the hotel in order to facilitate his son's education. The McLoughlin family sought to adopt Daniel, but I can't find whether they did or not, or how he is doing, which I think is good. He deserves some peace, as does his half-sister Aisling. A family with 3 children lived in the house Siobhan was murdered in, but was up for sale for €1.4 million back in 2008. I presume it has been sold. Carney's daughter did live in the new house while he was still a free man, but there have been no updates on her either. If Carney decided to sell off all his assets and pay off his debts, he will have a fine chunk of change when he gets out. I would say he'll even be a millionaire. I do know the family were talking about suing him for Siobhan's share at least, if not all, but again there is no details on this publicly. Siobhan's sister Aisling released a statement after Carney's conviction. While their lives were utterly destroyed by Siobhan's death, Siobhan had now got justice. She said, "We are so blessed to have known and to have had someone as special as Shawnee in our lives," which was their nickname for her. "But we miss her every hour of every day, and the unbearable longing to see her and to protect her never leaves us, even though you know it's too late." In December 2002, a temporary door in commemoration of 16 days of activism against gender violence was installed outside Ringsend Library in Dublin. On International Women's Day in 2008, a permanent structure created by Joe Moran was installed in memory of all the women who had died from 1995 to 2007 due to gender domestic violence. 88 of these women died in their own home. Of course, since 2007, this number is much higher. The door represents anyone's hall door, behind which victims of domestic violence feel trapped, so it is left ajar to symbolise that there is always help for those suffering domestic abuse, literally on the other side of the door. The week of this unveiling, 2 men were convicted of killing their wives, one being Siobhan and the other being Karen Guinea.